and to get started on our journey, because it was kind of like the beginning of everything in a lot of ways.
It was an eternity ago. I can't believe how long ago this was, but yet how fresh it is in my brain.
It is weird, right? I still dream about a lot of it all the time.
I remember back then, like, we would watch videos that were like maybe 5 years old, at the most 10 years old, and think that that was like such an old video, and now these are like almost 25 years old, some of them. Like, I can't even fathom, like, that it's been that.
All the civilization.
Sometime in the 8th or 9th century, somewhere on the island of Great Britain, an unknown British poet clambered through the rubble of an overgrown ruin. Like so many people from this age, which has been called the Dark Ages, we don't know this poet's name. We don't know when they were born or when they died, even where they're from. But they wrote a poem in the language of Old English that has survived to this day, and that poem gives us a glimpse into the lost and decaying world they inhabited. It was a world of mystery, scattered with the enormous crumbling ruins of a bygone age.
How wondrous this wallstone, shattered by fate. Castles were smashed, the work of giants crumbled. Ruined are the roofs, tumbled the towers, broken the barred gates. Frost in the plaster, ceilings are gaping. Torn away, fallen, eaten by age.
This poem is known simply as The Ruin, and it's thought the ruin it describes is that of the British Roman town of Bath. The poem itself has come down to us as something of a ruined object too. It was damaged by fire at some point in history so that its words break off and cut out, just like the shattered masonry it describes. But what we have is enough to picture the crumbling ruined buildings and the effect they had on its poet. You can almost feel the light falling through the broken roof and smell the still water where luxurious baths once stood. You can picture the solitary figure of the poet clambering over the piles of masonry, and you can almost hear them wondering, who built this place? How did they construct the vaults of these cavernous halls? And why, after everything they'd built, did they leave it all behind? My name's Paul Cooper, and you're listening to the Fall of Civilizations podcast. Each episode, I look at a civilization of the past that rose to glory and then collapsed into the ashes of history. I want to ask, what did they have in common? What led to their fall? And what did it feel like to be a person alive at the time who witnessed the end of their world? In this episode of Fall of Civilizations, I want to look not at the collapse of a whole empire, but at just one part of it,
Greg? Hope you're doing good,
the
man.
island of
Good
Great
Saturday
Britain,
to you too, bro.
as it was under the rule of the Roman Empire. I want to show how a great civilization was built almost overnight and endured
see
the
my man.
test
How are
of
you?
centuries against overwhelming odds. I want to explore its fatal flaws and describe what happened after its final dramatic collapse. At the time the poetry of the ruin was written, Roman Britain was already a distant memory. It was remembered as a time of giants and legends.
Oh wow, insane.
But for nearly 4 centuries until its fall, Britannia had been one of the Roman Empire's most enduring possessions. To get to the start of this story, we have to rewind back through the centuries, to the 1st century BC, when the power and confidence of the Roman Empire was at its height. This was the very twilight of the period we call the Roman Republic.
Bro.
And in this period, Rome was
Dude,
still a kind of
P90X, that's
democracy.
serious, man.
While
That's
power was
intense, high
concentrated in the
intensity.
wealthy
Oh, it's the high
landowning
intensity
classes,
training you were
Rome
talking
did
about. I
hold
understand.
elections, and the power of the
Makes
Senate
sense
acted
now,
as
I
a check
understand
on
what
the
you're
might of
saying.
its rulers.
I was like, what's HIT?
Under this
HH?
system,
High
Rome
intensity training? That
conquered
makes
vast swathes
sense.
of territory
Dude.
across Europe,
Hell yeah,
into
man.
Greece and Turkey, and along the North
Holy
African
shit, dude, that's
coast.
awesome, man. Go for it, man.
Its empire was vast and
Push through it,
constantly
buddy.
expanding.
Push through it. You're
But at
gonna
this
find,
point,
you're gonna
the
become
ragged chalk
fucking
coast of the British
push
Isles
through that barrier,
was
whatever
still the
barrier it
frontier
is,
of what
max
the
out.
Romans called
Hell
the
yeah.
known world. Britain for Rome was a mysterious and frightening place. According to Plutarch, some even believed the island of Britain was a legend.
The island furnished much matter of dispute. Some argued that its name and story had been fabricated, that it had never existed.
Although the crossing from mainland Europe to the British Isles is only 30 kilometers at its narrowest point, it's a body of water exposed to the harsh weather systems of
stream
the
where you
North
get to
Sea
give
and
sub,
North
thanks, bro, for
Atlantic. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus describes its dangerous and unpredictable nature.
Do I wear socks when I speed run GoldenEye? I do. I have to wear socks.
And then sinks again to be as flat as a level plain.
Otherwise my feet just get too cold.
By the middle of the 1st century BC, this treacherous and unpredictable crossing had already defeated the ambitions of several generals and emperors. Julius Caesar famously invaded the British Isles twice, in 55 and 54 BC. And both of these campaigns did little
No,
more
man,
than sink
no.
Roman life and treasure
No, dude.
into the marshy lands of Kent
No,
and the
dude.
Thames Valley.
I mean, yes, dude,
Caesar
welcome, dude.
would go
I
on
mean,
to
but I
gather
mean
all
that
of the
quote,
power
oh
of
my
Rome's
god.
institutions to himself.
I know now you were
And he
taking the
would pass
you were
Rome
taking the
onto his
piss with
successor,
me with
Caesar
that quote.
Augustus,
With that quote,
as a
I understand
dictatorship.
now.
Augustus, who ruled as the first
At
Roman
4:30,
emperor,
oh, for you,
planned 3
yeah.
separate invasions of Britain that each
4:30, yeah,
fizzled
alright,
out
bro.
uselessly. And generations later, the notorious mad Emperor Caligula even amassed a great invasion force of 200,000 men on the Normandy coast, poised to take the island of Britain for Rome. And this attempt might have been successful, had Caligula not been the mad emperor. On a whim, he reportedly ordered his men to give up the invasion of Britain and gather seashells from the Normandy beaches instead. Britain for the Romans was an unobtainable prize. It was a land of mystery, peopled by wild and unpredictable barbarians. After returning from his failed invasions, Julius Caesar wrote with palpable horror about the British
Oh,
inhabitants.
hell yeah, bro. Yes, dude.
Most of the inland
Yeah, man, you're the
inhabitants do not
fucking
sow
man, dude.
corn, but live
How you
on
feeling,
milk
man? You
and
must be
flesh,
feeling good.
and are clad with skins.
You must be feeling good, my
All the
dude.
Britons
That's
dye
amazing.
themselves
You know how
with
awesome that
wool,
is?
which gives them a
That puts such a big
bluish colour
smile on my
and a
face, in my
terrifying
heart.
appearance in battle.
Hell
They
yeah,
wear
bro.
their hair long and have every
What?
part
Feel
of their
really
body
nice,
shaved,
man. Yeah, buddy.
except the head and upper lip.
Do it for the
It was
The
the Emperor
endorphins, my
Claudius
man.
who
Hell yeah,
finally
bro.
enveloped this wild
Nice.
and dangerous place into the Empire of Rome. Claudius successfully landed 4 legions, that's 20,000 men, on the British coast. He waited behind on the continent, perhaps wisely considering the failures
Got a
of
lot of
his
work to do.
predecessors.
Yeah, but you know what,
And he
dude?
must
It's
have
like I
listened
was thinking that with
eagerly
like
as every new
skateboarding.
report
With
came
me, I'm
back to
not a
him.
very good
As
skateboarder,
his
but
men landed in Kent, crossed its chalk
it takes me
downs
so
and
much
valleys,
effort to do
and
anything,
marched
and by
north
the end
to
of
the
my
river
session,
estuaries of
I
the
feel
Thames.
like I'm sweating. Like, and
There,
it's like the
an
biggest
enormous
workout of my
mass
life.
British fighters awaited.
So it's, you know, any progress
The
is
battle went
progress,
on
right?
for
Steps
2
forward.
days.
That's hell yeah, man.
An incredibly long battle in an era
You know
that was
where I
mostly
started with my
characterized by
weightlifting
short
stream? I
and
started
brutal
with
confrontations.
weightlifting stream number 1.
And after a fierce
Yes.
resistance, the British forces retreated
Not
to the
saying I'm
banks of the
wise,
River
but
Thames.
that's where you fucking
The
start.
Romans followed,
At
wading and
day
swimming
number
through the
1.
marshes of Essex, using their engineering expertise to build bridges across the swampy ground. And after a
You've been there
final
for, like,
bloody
all
clash,
200
British
before.
resistance was crushed.
So hell yeah, bro.
It wasn't until
And more to
victory was
come.
all but assured that the Emperor Claudius himself
Yeah, man,
arrived on
soon
British shores.
you'll be giving me tips. I'm not a big
Famously,
tip
he
taker.
brought with him a terrifying symbol of
take
Roman
tips very
power,
well.
a tamed war elephant brought from Africa.
I'm joking.
To the poor Britons witnessing the arrival of their conquerors, the sight of this animal, the heavy thuds of its footfalls and the rattling of its mighty chains must have ended any
Oh, yeah,
thought they
dude.
had of
Greg
successful
and Moonraker
resistance.
doing that? Fuck yeah.
From there, Roman troops swept across the rest of the country with ruthless efficiency, into Wales and the British Midlands, subduing tribes as they went. But when they reached the rugged heath and hills of Caledonia, that's modern Scotland, the Romans met their match. These lands were ruled by fierce confederations of tribes, among them powerful warrior clans like the Picts and the Meatae. The Roman historian Cassius Dio writes about these peoples with particular contempt.
These tribes inhabit wild and waterless mountains and desolate and swampy plains, possessing
Don't let
neither
your
walls,
memes be
cities,
dreams,
nor
true.
fields. They dwell in tents,
a good
naked
quote.
and unshod,
That's actually a
and
very
are
good
very
quote.
fond of plundering.
We don't know what the Picts called themselves, since almost nothing of their language has survived. The word Pict is what the Romans called them, and it comes from the same root as the English word picture. It means painted, referring to the brilliant war paint they wore into battle. Today, we know them by the beautiful ritual standing stones they left across Scotland, decorated with mesmerizing walls and curls. But whatever else we know about them, we know that these tribal people fought with enough ferocity that the Roman advance was halted. The Picts knew their land well, and they were well versed in what we
hate this
today
game.
would call guerrilla warfare.
Like, come on, man.
The Romans knew
What?
when to quit. They ceased their
Come
advance
on,
and
man.
declared the border with Caledonia to be the final limit of their empire. They built forts along a jutting cliff that ran the whole width of the country, a shelf of igneous dolerite that formed a natural barrier between the Roman lands and the lands of the Picts. One rare writing tablet, found in a rubbish heap in one of these forts and dated
Thanks
to
for
the
being
year
my friend.
92 AD, shows the Roman frustration with their ongoing battles with this bunch of ragtag natives.
The Britons are unprotected by armor. There are very many cavalry. The cavalry do not use swords, nor do the Britunculi take up fixed positions to throw their javelins.
The word Britunculi is interesting because it has never been seen in any other Roman source. It's a kind of slang that loosely translates to nasty little Britons, and it gives you a sense of how the Romans felt
What was
about
that
their new
slang
subjects.
for nasty little Britain? British?
In the year 120
Damn
AD,
it, we gotta go
the
back
Emperor
and listen to
Hadrian
it. Are we
visited
really?
Britain, and he was dismayed to find the Roman troops there still beset with rebellions
Yeah,
and
bro.
raids.
We got him.
But he was impressed with the natural fortification given by this ridge of volcanic stone they were carrying. They ceased their advance and declared the border with Caledonia to be the final limit of their empire. They built forts along a jutting cliff that ran the whole width of the country, a shelf of igneous dolerite that formed a natural barrier between the Roman lands and the lands of the Picts. One rare writing tablet, found in a rubbish heap in one of these forts and dated to the year 92 AD, shows the Roman frustration with their ongoing battles with this bunch of ragtag natives.
The Britons are unprotected by armor. There are very many cavalry. The cavalry do not use swords, nor do the Britunculi take up fixed positions to throw their javelins.
The word Britunculi is interesting because it has never been seen in any other Roman source. It's a kind of slang that loosely translates to nasty little Britons, and it gives you a sense of how the Romans felt about their new subjects.
Britempoli. As the Romans,
AD,
I'm gonna add
the
that as
Emperor
a quote. That's
Hadrian visited
hilarious.
Britain, and he was dismayed to find the Roman troops there still beset with rebellions and raids. But he was impressed with the natural fortification given by this ridge of volcanic stone they were camped on. He ordered this barrier to be made more fortified, with the construction of what would become the largest Roman artifact in the world, a mighty wall stretching 135 kilometers from coast to coast. This border wall would be known as Hadrian's Wall, and the Romans defended it with garrisons of infantry and cavalry stationed in a string of forts all the way along its length. And the Romans weren't satisfied with this border. They would make multiple attempts to push it further north into Caledonia, but all of these attempts would fail. At one point, they even built another wall, known as the Antonine Wall, 160 kilometers further to the north, at the narrowest point of the British Isles. It spans 63 kilometers from coast to coast, but it turned out to be useless. The land of Caledonia was ungovernable, and the Antonine Wall was abandoned each time it was tried, its stones left to crumble into the peaty earth of the Scottish moors. But Hadrian's barrier stood. Rome led occasional scouting parties out into the space between the two walls. They went to barter for truces, exchange hostages, and initiate trade. And the Romans knew when to spot a bargain. Vast hordes of Roman coins found north of Hadrian's Wall suggest that for at least some of the time, Rome was paying the Picts to hold back their attacks. Meanwhile, south of this snaking line of stone, Roman Britain settled into a restive peace. There were uprisings at first, the most famous of these led by the warrior Queen Boudica of the Iceni tribe, only 17 years after the conquest of southern Britain. Rome crushed this adventure brutally, and with it some of the last organized resistance to their rule. But the province of Britannia would never quite be pacified. Everyone knows that old saying that Rome wasn't built in a day. But in Roman regional capitals like London and Colchester, these cities really did seem to go up overnight. If you compare Singapore or Dubai to photos of those cities in the 1980s, you might get a sense of how it must have felt to live in London in the decades after the Romans arrived. A small, marshy fishing town suddenly transformed in the space of only a few decades into a glittering metropolis. Despite their colourful pantheon of gods, the real religion of the Romans was the religion of urbanism, the cult of the city. And they replicated the structure of Rome in every city they built. In London, Rome built an ornate forum and a theatre, enormous public buildings with marble fronts and tiled roofs, unlike anything the Britons had seen before. A new elite of Roman governors, civil servants and statesmen poured in, and their luxurious villas went up around the countryside. These residences were resplendent, with mosaics and baths, even underfloor heating. And each city they built became another hub in the network of roads along which imperial commodities moved. Urban Britons could now enjoy incenses and perfumes, amphoras of wine and red gloss pottery from Gaul, olive oil from Spain, along with pepper and spices brought from as far as India. In exchange, Britain supplied precious metals to the Roman world, gold and silver as well as lead and iron. Perhaps most importantly, the shores of Cornwall and Devon were a rich source of tin, a rare metal in the ancient world that was crucial for making bronze. But despite these benefits, Britannia was always a costly possession. Records show that larger amounts of resources were poured into the island than were ever taken out. And some at least must have realized that the empire couldn't fund this outpost forever. Part of the cost of holding Britain as a colony was due to its countryside, a hotbed of rebellion. Native Britons lived in small villages of timber, turf-walled roundhouses that dotted the land. And here, tribal loyalties held greater sway than any loyalty people felt to their Roman governors. A good way to think about the situation is to look at the recent occupation of Iraq by the United States, Britain, and their allies. In Roman times, fortified green zones went up across Britain too, walled compounds where foreign administrators poured in to enforce the new structure of imperial society. Tomb inscriptions from York show imperial officials coming from as far as Africa, France, Sardinia, and Greece. A rotating cast of governors came and went too. These figures often stayed in their post for only 3 years or so, and none of them were native to Britain. And although we don't have complete records, there's also no evidence of native Britons ever rising to the social rank necessary to govern. This is a situation quite different to other Roman colonies like Gaul, where Rome made some effort to bring indigenous people on board with the imperial project. So while some Britons might have felt the material benefits of Roman rule, it seems they never really felt part of the shared destiny that bound the rest of the empire together during its height. Perhaps partly for this reason, it seemed the British countryside was only ever one step from anarchy. This threat of rebellion from within was coupled with raids by the Picts and the Meatae on the walled northern border. And the rich traffic of trade coming to and from Europe also created a booming industry in piracy. Sea-going tribes like the Saxons became increasingly bold, braving the stormy waters of the North Sea to harass shipping, and even make incursions onto the British coast. So even in this first century of Roman rule in Britain, the pressures that would eventually crush it like a tin can began to bear in from every side. One of the key measures that archaeologists use to track the cycle of peace and war in the ancient world is to look at the frequency of buried coin hoards. Put yourself in the position of a person living in the ancient world. When times are good, you feel secure enough to store your silver coins or your gold jewelry in your home or in the family vault, or even in an early form of bank. But when times are bad, you can't risk that. You might bury your silver as an extra precaution, or you do so in a panic when you see the first plumes of black smoke begin to show over the horizon. And in times of mild unrest, people would come back to dig these up again later, once the danger had passed. But if the unrest is serious enough, there might not be anyone left to retrieve it. In that case, the coins remain in the ground with the dates and emperors stamped meticulously on their surface. This is bad news for their owner, of course, but it's good news for archaeologists who want to track a region's history of unrest. I'm going to pick up our story again at a point where people in Roman Britain were once again burying their coins in record numbers, right as the 2nd century draws to a close. Since the end of the Roman Republic, Rome had undergone nearly 2 centuries of constant expansion, and the constant wars on its borders had been matched by a relative peace within its lands, a period known as the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace. But as the year 200 approached, this relative peace in the Roman Empire's interior was beginning to shatter. Plague had ravaged Rome's lands, a devastating disease brought back from the east by soldiers on campaign. It killed 2,000 people a day in Rome at its height, and it decimated the imperial army, leading to as many as 5 million deaths across Europe. And trouble had reigned in the political world as well. Since the time of Julius Caesar and his successor Augustus, the Roman emperor had been a dictator with supreme power. The Senate and judiciary were nothing but agents of his command, rather than representing any kind of popular will. And wherever absolute power exists, there are always men who will risk everything to claim it. Against a backdrop of plague and famine, civil wars began to erupt across Europe over rival claims to the total power of the imperial throne. And in these wars, it was quite often the generals stationed in Britannia, the empire's farthest and bleakest province, who would hear the drums of war beat the loudest. To understand why Britannia was such a source of trouble, you only have to look at the particular paradox that Roman Britain presented. All of the threats facing it from outside and within meant that the land required the constant presence of an enormous army to defend it. As many as 40,000 soldiers at its height. That's about 1/8 of the entire imperial army, just to put that in perspective. And this meant that any one man put in charge of Britannia's defense force was automatically one of the empire's most powerful men. The paradox might not seem apparent at first, but this was one of the fatal flaws that led to the repeated humbling and the final fall of Roman Britain. When discussing the Romans, it's easy to get bogged down in the endless chain of colourful characters. The schemers and the drunks and the zealots, the charlatans and the soldiers that leap out at us from the histories. I want to avoid getting dragged too much into relating the stories of each and every person who had a role in the collapse of Roman Britain. But I think it does help us to zoom in on some of these personalities, so we get a sense of the kind of person responsible for what happened next. And the first character in this story is a man named Clodius Albinus. That's because Albinus is one of the first generals to make what I will call the British mistake. He will be the first, but by no means the last. Born in Tunisia to a humble family, Albinus was African. But the name Albinus means white, and he was given this name due to the extraordinary paleness of his complexion. On his birth, his father wrote a letter about this strange phenomenon.
A son was born to me on the 7th day before the calends of December, and so white was his body at birth that it was whiter than the linen clothes in which we wrapped him.
Albinus's unusual physical appearance doesn't seem to have held him back. He grew up a promising soldier and rose through the ranks of the Roman military on the basis of his skill. When he was appointed governor of Britannia, Albinus stayed for longer than many before him, and we have a good account of his physical appearance in the Historia Augusta.
He was tall of stature, with unkempt curly hair and a broad expanse of brow. His skin was wonderfully white. He had a womanish voice, almost as shrill as a eunuch's.
The life of governor seemed to suit Albinus, and he might have spent the rest of his life in Britannia governing well and rising through the ranks of Roman society, were it not for the events that were about to unleash blood and chaos across the wide expanse of the Western Roman Empire. The beginning of these events was the death of the tyrannical Emperor Commodus in the year 192 AD. You might remember him if you've ever seen Russell Crowe's Gladiator.
That's what I'm doing wrong, I'm not looking up enough.
And when Commodus died without an heir and left multiple claimants behind, the whole empire descended once again into chaos. This is the period that would cause the historian Cassius Dio to write his famous lament.
Our history now descends from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust.
The name given to this time, the Year of the Five Emperors, might give you some idea of the ensuing pandemonium. These 5 claimants to the imperial throne fought and died. They burnt cities to the ground, they slaughtered vast armies, until there were only 2 credible candidates left. One of these was Albinus, the pale Tunisian stationed with his legions in Britain, who was a favorite of the Roman Senate. But the other claimant was the man sitting on the throne in Rome.
Come on, man.
The ruthless emperor, Septimus Severus. Back in Britain, Albinus gave a dramatic speech before his British legions, addressing them in that high-pitched but piercing voice. He announced that he wanted to restore the ancient democratic power of the Roman Senate, a radical statement for a prospective ruler to make. Albinus's soldiers cheered him, and they announced that he was the only emperor they served. It was a clear declaration of rebellion. The Senate soon sent Albinus messages of support, and with his men's loyalty secured, Albinus decided to march on Rome.
I don't know why I did that. That was so dumb. I should just stay in fucking
and he
right,
couldn't spare
honestly.
a single man. He took 3 legions, every last soldier in Britain, and sailed for the mainland in the year 195. He must have been buoyed up by such a sense of destiny on that voyage, and it would have been an inspiring sight, those tens of thousands of legionaries in their bright armor, the sea thick with ships, all sailing to Rome to restore its ancient republic. But Albinus would not succeed. Despite being popular in Gaul and amassing a vast following, he was finally defeated 2 years later at the Battle of Lugdunum. It was a bloody and drawn-out affair, lasting over 2 days. Again, an excruciatingly long battle in this era. The clash involved as many as 300,000 soldiers, and for a time it looked like Albinus would win.
Fucking dumb.
But then the tide turned. His men began to flee the battlefield, and Albinus realized that all was lost.
Guys, why
That
did I
all
get
his
shot
sacrifices had been
twice?
for nothing.
Like, why?
He ran himself through with his
Like,
own
why?
dagger.
Like, are you serious
And
right
the
now?
Emperor Severus
Are you actually
wasn't
serious?
kind in victory. He rode his horse over Albinus's mangled body, and
It's
then
just so
paraded
dumb,
his
man.
head on a pike. He beheaded his family and purged his followers. The power of the emperor as supreme dictator remained, and the Senate got quietly back into line. Albinus had lost everything.
Like, he's just so dumb, dude.
But
That
his
was really
dash for
dumb. I
Rome
think because
had
you're
also
in left
cost his
strafe, you
province
get
dearly.
shot more. You get just
Over
more
the
open
long
to
2
get
years
shot.
he had been at
It's
war,
really just
Albinus
fucking
had left
dumb
Britannia
shit.
completely undefended. And with no garrison, the land had descended into anarchy. At this time, a huge part of Britain's economy was driven by the constant presence of a Roman army. So people employed to supply these men, to make them bread and forge them swords, repair the leather of their stirrups. All these people suddenly had no job and no way to support themselves. Local rebellions spread
18
across the
shots,
country,
minus 45 degrees.
while outside forces raided and plundered with impunity. Picts from
I guess I have to
Scotland,
do it in the game,
Scotti
man. I
from
can't just
Ireland,
say
and
it.
Saxons from the
This
sea
doesn't validate
all
anything.
combined to ravage the land that
13
Albinus had
shots,
left behind.
51 degrees.
Rome would eventually return to take back control. But even 10 years later, in the year 207, the Roman statesman put back in charge still wrote with fear about the dire situation the country faced.
Barbarians there are in revolt, overrunning the country, carrying off treasure and destroying most things.
So that's the heart of what I'm calling the British mistake. The paradox is that any sufficiently large force able to occupy Britain also presented an irresistible temptation to its commander. Any force that could hold Britain could also take Rome. And so the moment the imperial crown was up for grabs, Britain's governor would pile all his soldiers onto ships and march on the Eternal City, leaving Britain undefended. The Emperor Septimus Severus, soon after trampling Albinus's body beneath the hooves of his horse, sailed to Britain to ensure that never again would another challenger arise. In response to attacks from the north, he led a huge army into Scotland to drive the attackers back into their lands. But Severus didn't have Albinus's way with the native Britons. It seems this ill-conceived adventure achieved nothing, with the border exactly where it had always been. But for good measure, he split the province of Britannia in two to limit the power of any one governor. But it wouldn't last. For Roman Britain, the clock was ticking, and although Albinus was one of the first generals to make this mistake, he was far from the last. One thing we will learn over the course of this series
Can you
is that
imagine
the
if you
fall
do
of
that every single run? You just
civilization
run
is
back
rarely
and just
simple.
blow the freaking. I think the
Roman
lag
rule
would be a
ended
lot
in
more
different
lag
parts
if you
of
do the
Britain
upload and
at
it goes
different
south
times
to over the pass
and under
away.
different circumstances.
Pretty cool though.
It came along with the collapse of Roman authority across Western Europe, and this occurred after the time of Albinus, a 50-year
See,
period
left
called
strafe
the military
is
anarchy.
way better. I might do
This
left
era
strafe. I'm not
saw
saying
at
it's
least
better, but I'm
26
better at
claimants
left strafe than I
contest
am
the
at right
imperial
strafe.
throne. Incessant civil wars and rampant inflation crippled the Roman economy, and German tribes made incursions into the empire's territory. It seemed like 1,000 different pressures rained down from all sides. And in all of this, despite the Emperor Severus's measures, Britain would remain a fertile staging ground for rebellion. In the year 260, for instance, a Roman commander called Postumus staged an insurrection that carved Britain and Gaul away from the empire for 10 years before it was retaken by Rome. A quarter century later, in the year 286, a Roman naval commander called Carausius, a common man who had risen through the ranks, declared himself Emperor of Britain and ruled for 7 years before being overcome himself. And it wasn't all a history of failures. In the year 306, the man who had become known as Emperor Constantine the Great was crowned emperor in York. He successfully marched on Rome, and although he spent the next 20 years fighting rival claimants in a series of bitter civil wars, he was ultimately crowned emperor over both the Eastern and the Western Roman empires. For much of the 3rd century, Rome was at war with itself, and the events of this time changed the empire forever. Rome's emperors were now military strongmen. Trade across the empire had broken down, impoverishing its people, while at the same time Rome's wealthy were now an ultra-rich elite, far richer than they had ever been in history. Meanwhile, the empire's enemies grew stronger and more organized, learning how to play to Rome's weaknesses, learning how to win. And as the 4th century dawned, Roman Britain's troubles would only increase. One event would soon lay bare just how far the Roman Empire's power had fallen, and it's remembered to history as the Great Barbarian Conspiracy. To set the scene, we have to imagine the winter of 367, on the Roman garrison at Hadrian's Wall.
That is $1 million
The
idea.
winters in this
I'm
part
telling
of the
you,
world
man.
are harsh. Cruel winds and
ChatGPT.
rain would have lashed the men stationed on the wall, their breath visible in the air.
Even if they made an AI
This was the
version
last
of that, like a
bastion against the
cartoon,
wild tribes of
kids
the
would
north,
love it.
and conditions here were harsh.
You can make a children's
Letters
show
these
so
soldiers
easily.
wrote at the time include complaints about the cold that bit at their feet every day, the lack of holidays, and not
Completely
enough
with
beer
AI.
provided in their rations. But it's still hard to imagine exactly what was behind the decision these men took next.
It's pretty amazing.
Perhaps it was hunger, cold, or fear. Perhaps they were even bribed. There was no shortage of Roman coin north of the wall, let's remember. Whatever the reason, the soldiers tasked with defending the empire's northern border mutinied. They changed sides and allowed a waiting army of Picts from Caledonia
so
to
terrible.
cross the wall. This horde swept down on the towns and villages of Northumbria. Villages burned, men and women were put to the sword. But before the Romans could send the usual reinforcements to quash this invasion, something astonishing happened. Immediately, waves of tribesmen of the fierce Atticoti from the Outer Isles, Scotti from Ireland and Saxons from Germania
Scotti
began to land on
from
Britain's
Ireland.
coasts. At the same time, parties of
my
Franks
boy
and Saxons
Scotty.
landed on the mainland
Scotty's
in northern
British, though.
Gaul. And these didn't seem like random attacks. They seemed to be coordinated raids, like
Fuck
nothing
off,
else
man.
the so-called barbarian tribes had ever attempted before. They completely overwhelmed the Roman defenses. Everywhere, Roman towns burned. Cities were sacked. And amid the chaos, slaves
That may have been my
escaped,
fastest
and whole units
pause,
of
though.
soldiers deserted in
That was like a
terror.
32-second.
All of these gathering together into
pause.
bands that roamed the countryside, resorting
That
to
was my
theft
fastest
and
pause
murder to
ever.
support
I'm pretty
themselves.
sure.
The historian Ammianus Marcellinus paints a scene of pure chaos.
Almost certainly. That's why I was so frustrated that they
Commanding
just
general of
randomly
the
shot me
Sea Coast was
twice.
killed, and another general, Philophaudes, was ambushed by the enemy and taken prisoner. The Atticoti, a warlike race of men, and the Scots, were ranging wildly and causing great devastation, while the Gallic regions were harassed by the Franks and their neighbours, the Saxons, with cruel robbery, fire, and the murder of all who were taken prisoners.
For 2 whole years, anarchy ruled in northern Europe, until Rome sent its best general, Flavius
let's go.
Theodosius, to march on the roaming barbarian
I gotta
bands.
look up more, man. Honestly. Just look
Theodosius
up more,
defeated
bro.
some in battle,
Just
and
do
he
it.
offered an amnesty to others. Order slowly returned to the region, but the damage was done. The attack of the Great Conspiracy had come as a complete surprise. And when we think about the effect this might have had on the people of the time, it wouldn't be too far off to think of this as something like the September 11th attacks on the United States. These were coordinated, brutal strikes, calculated to cause maximum fear and damage, and they shook the very core of the empire. Rome's confidence in the face of the barbarian threat would never recover. The empire's reduced ability to protect itself was one factor in the collapse of Roman Britain, but it was only one of many. Britannia's economy had been in decline for decades, with reduced trade to other parts of the empire disrupted by the century of civil wars, by barbarian invasions and piracy on the sea. Pottery produced in Britain began to drastically reduce in variety and decoration around this time, and iron production in the south plummeted. Whole kilns were abandoned and the price of iron skyrocketed. Around the year 350, the Roman sewers in Canterbury started clogging up, and no one bothered to clear them. A thick layer of silt also began to build up in the public baths that everywhere stood as a symbol of Roman civilization. This decline was beginning to seep into every aspect of British life. But it was one man, an ambitious and hot-headed general called Magnus Maximus, who would play a pivotal part in
Magnus
tipping the land
Maximus,
over
what an
into its
awesome
final
name.
fall. It's often said that history repeats itself. We're told that if we study its lessons, we can avoid making the same mistakes twice. But I think that happens a lot less than people realize. Events are so complex that nothing ever really happens the same way twice. But just occasionally in the
That's gotta
flow
be
of
like
history,
the best name
you do
in
get these
history.
eddies and whirlpools, where it really does feel like people keep doing the same thing over and over, like the rerun of a movie we've seen before. And if Magnus Maximus had been a reader of history, if he had read the story of that previous governor of Britain, Albinus the White Tunisian, and his ill-fated march on Rome, he might have done things a little differently as the 4th century entered its final decades. Like Albinus, Maximus was a distinguished general. He was from the Galatian region of northern Spain, and he had served in fearsome campaigns in Africa and against German tribes on the Danube River. He had also been among the army of Flavius Theodosius,
Gotta look up,
which had
man.
returned order after the events
My
of
first
the
few
Great
bullets have got
Conspiracy.
to be to pass him away, not the other guards.
Maximus was also interesting for being a devout Christian, a
What?
religion that was outlawed in the
I'm
Roman
so
Empire
sloppy,
only one
man.
lifetime before.
I gotta aim for like 3
Maximus
headshot
was
bullets there,
assigned
or
as the
maybe
governor of
6.
Britain in the year 380.
Ideally 3, as
And
I
in
was
his first
practicing
year,
for
he
with this.
faced down an army of Picts and Scots
the
that had
glass
overrun
guard
Hadrian's wall, perhaps emboldened by Rome's recent weakness. After crushing this threat, Maximus celebrated by building a huge church on London's Tower Hill. But like other governors of Britannia before him, Maximus had ambitions greater than simply commanding a garrison in the empire's wettest and windiest dominion. For the last decade of his life, Maximus had watched from afar as an incredibly unpopular emperor had sat on the imperial throne. This emperor was a young man named Gratian, and he is one of these particularly colourful characters that leap out of the Roman histories. Gratian loved to hunt, and bizarrely, he spent all his time in the company of a band of Scythian archers. These were men from beyond the Danube River, outside the bounds of the Roman Empire. That is, to the Romans, they were barbarians. The young emperor loved the culture of his Scythian friends. He even used to appear at court dressed in the full traditional garb of a Scythian warrior, an ornately patterned overcoat and furs. And the Roman people seemed to tolerate this eccentric emperor for a while. But in the year 378, Rome would suffer a horrifying blow. The Emperor Valens, who ruled over the eastern portion of the empire, had brought a massive army of 30,000 men to crush a rebellion of Goths and Huns barely more than 10,000 strong. Confident in his coming victory, the Emperor Valens attacked them without waiting for reinforcements. These Goth rebels stood and fought, and astonishingly, they won. The Emperor Valens was killed along with 20,000 of his men, and his body was never recovered. This loss shook Rome to the core. Barbarian armies were now causing havoc across Rome's eastern territories, flouting the authority of the empire. And suddenly, the Emperor Gratian dressing up like a barbarian didn't seem quite so acceptable. The people of Rome turned on him, and around the empire, all other claimants to the throne sensed their chance. They began to gather their armies. And once again, the British paradox came into play. The hot-headed zealot Magnus Maximus, just like Albinus before him, commanded a vast army in Britain. And he, like his predecessor, resolved to march on Rome. Just like Albinus, he knew he couldn't spare a single man. He took the entire Roman garrison of Britannia, piled it onto a fleet of ships, and set sail for Gaul in the year 383. With Maximus on his way to Rome, Britain was once again left undefended. We can never know if any of Maximus's advisors told him about the story of Albinus, the pale-skinned Tunisian who had marched on Rome. Did no one on that creaking ship, sailing its way to the continent, not one of them, mention to Maximus what had happened nearly 200 years before, when the last governor of Britain had tried to become emperor? I find this hard to believe, but that's part of history's spell. It teaches us lessons, even as it convinces us that these lessons don't apply to us, that we'll be the ones to break its endless chain.
That's what I need to improve
For Maximus,
today.
at least,
That
nothing
box
mattered to him
guard.
except reaching Rome and seizing the purple robes of the emperor for himself.
Everything else is just fucking
And the zealous Maximus did seem to be blessed. Everywhere he went, legions that were sent to fight him instead joined his cause. Enraged, the Emperor Gratian met his army outside Paris, and Maximus's forces won the day. The young emperor fled with his Scythian bodyguards, and he was killed soon after, while Magnus Maximus declared himself emperor. But this is where the luck of Maximus runs out. Before he'd even begun to rule, his support slowly collapsed, and it did so in part because of the anarchy he left behind in Britannia. Just like Albinus, he had left his home province, the heart of his supporters, completely undefended. Just as before, raiders and pirates now devastated the coasts and northern towns. The departure of the land's garrison had caused an economic collapse too, and Maximus had also taxed Britain brutally to pay for his wars. Now rebellions spread like a fire through dry heather. The date of Maximus's departure, 383,
even if
is
it's
the
there,
last
let's see
date
what this
ever to
time
be
is.
found on a Roman
It's
coin
just too
in
slow. I
Wales.
feel like OCR.
It's the last date too,
It's like
for any
2
archaeological
seconds.
trace in the northern Pennine Hills. In these places, it marked the end of Roman rule in Britain. The 6th century British cleric St. Gildas put it more bluntly in his searing rant entitled "On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain."
Britain is left deprived of all her soldiery and armed bands, of her cruel governors, and of the flower of her youth, who went with Maximus but never again returned. The Scots from the northwest and the Picts from the north, like hungry and ravening wolves, rush with greedy jaws upon the fold which is left without a shepherd.
From this point, the British economy was in freefall. After this time, British coffins stopped being sealed with nails, and boots lost their hobnails.
Come on.
This shows how expensive iron had become. British people now slipped on icy ground and rotted in flimsy coffins. Pottery became a lost art, and the suburbs of the cities began to empty. The astonishing thing is, Maximus was not even the last governor of Britain to make this mistake. This dishonor would fall to a common soldier called Constantine, who once and for all ended the Roman presence in Britain. He was named after the great 4th century emperor who had been crowned in York 100 years before, and now this famous event would repeat itself as farce. After the departure of Maximus, a bloody power struggle had broken out in Britain, with rival factions tearing it to pieces like dogs after a strip of meat. This struggle resulted in the soldiers themselves choosing the new governor of Britannia,
Wow,
and
that
they
was lucky.
chose one of their own,
Wow,
common
the
soldier
luckiest
known
three
as Constantine.
animations.
The historian Orosius